Chapter 10. The Fire of God's Glory. One of the characteristics I've seen in God is through the fire of God. The fire of God's glory was manifest as a means of God's directions to the children of Israel. Exodus 13, verse 21, "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of a cloud, to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire, to give them light, to go by day and night." This was a continuous manifestation of God's goodness and glory among his people. Then, when Pharaoh's armies were about to overtake them at the Red Sea, God ordered his angel, who was in charge of the pillar of cloud, to switch positions and go behind God's people to act as a smokescreen to protect them from their enemies. What a protective God! And he's in business to equally care for his own today, and he hasn't run out of unheard-of ways to do it. In fact, he's the element specialist in that business. We need to understand that the fire of God's glory can be manifest in both blessing and judgment. Numbers 16, verse 18, "And they took every man his censer, and put fire in them, and laid incense thereon, and stood in the door of the tabernacle of the congregation with Moses and Aaron." Numbers 16, verse 24, "Speak unto the congregation, saying, Get you up from about the tabernacle of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram." Then God went into action. These 4 men found themselves with the ground splitting under them and being swallowed up alive as their screams charged the air. Then a fire came out from the Lord and consumed the other 250 rebellious men. We see from this account that the glory of the Lord appearing among the people was a sign that he had showed up, but not with his approving presence. In Numbers 14, we again see the glory of God being manifest at a time we would least expect. After the men had given a bad report to the children of Israel, after having spied out the land of Canaan, the people embarked on an all-out murmuring and complaining campaign against Moses and Aaron. The people questioned God's character, suggested returning to Egypt, and even proposed selecting another leader in order to do so. Moses and Aaron had their predictable humility reaction by falling on their faces before God as intercessors for the rebellious mob. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes and gave their version of what the Israelites should do. They exhorted the people not to rebel against the Lord, and strongly urged them with encouraging words to be not afraid, but to trust and obey God and enter into Canaan. The Israelites' reaction was violent. They planned to stone these men of God who had spoken the truth to them. God talked with Moses, announcing his plan to strike the people with diseases and to disinherit them, while starting over again by making a mightier nation with Moses. God expressed his dismay over the Israelites' rejection of his rulership and unbelief, despite the fact that they had repeatedly witnessed the incredible signs and wonders God had performed on their behalf. Moses' response as an intercessor is unsurpassed in human history, and his boldness can only be explained by the depth and intimacy of his knowledge of God's character. His greatest concern was for God himself, not the rebellious people he led, and certainly not himself. Philippians 2, verse 13, "For it is God which worketh in you both to will and do of his good pleasure." The closer the friendship, the more understanding of that person's character. God's response to his close friend was in the classic words, "I have pardoned according to your word." God goes on to make this amazing statement, "But truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord." I believe God is making the point that despite how humanity messes up on God's intended plans for them, there will come a day when God will display his complete glory by a show of all his characteristics. His name and character will be totally vindicated in heaven and earth and under the earth. That's when every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Finally, God displays his justice and judgment alongside his compassion and mercy by pronouncing that all those who rejected his rulership would die in the wilderness over the course of their lifespan and not enter in Canaan. while all those 20 years old and under would enter as promised. While God can extend mercy to us by our not getting what we deserve, we must always remember that we will reap what we sow. It is a spiritual law. Sin has its consequences. At the same time, to the depth and extent of our repentance and humbling ourselves, the sentence of reaping will be shortened. Micah 7 verses 18 and 19. Who is a God like unto thee, that pardoneth iniquity, and passeth by the transgression of the remnant of his heritage? He retaineth not his anger forever, because he delighteth in mercy. He will turn again. He will have compassion upon us. He will subdue our iniquities, and thou wilt cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. The fire of God's glory can be so awesome in its intensity that it can be overwhelming. The fire of God, the glory of God, and the power of God are closely linked, and the combination can be unbearably intense. 2 Chronicles 7 verses 1 through 3. Now when Solomon had made an end of praying, the fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. And the priest could not enter into the house of the Lord, because the glory of the Lord had filled the Lord's house. And when all the children of Israel saw how the fire came down, and the glory of the Lord upon the house, they bowed themselves with their faces to the ground upon the pavement, and worshipped and praised the Lord, saying, For he is good, for his mercy endureth forever. Isaiah 2 verse 5. O house of Jacob, come ye, and let us walk in the light of the Lord. That simply means to live according to God's standard of holiness found in his word. He then exposes the sin of idolatry that are manifested through materialism. Throughout this section, there are 7 strong references to God's action in humbling everyone who is proud. Pride is always the cause of all idolatry, everything that we place of importance more than an ardent pursuit of God himself. Isaiah 2 verse 11. The lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of man shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. Isaiah 2 verse 17. And the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of men shall be made low, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. That's God's radical, revolutionary uprising against man's greatest sin. Isaiah 2 verse 10. Enter into the rock, and hide thee in the dust, for the fear of the Lord, and for the glory of his majesty. Isaiah 2 verse 19. And they shall go into the holes of the rock, and into the caves of the earth, for fear of the Lord, and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. Isaiah 2 verse 21. To go into the clefts of the rocks, and into the tops of the ragged rocks, for fear of the Lord, and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. Unfortunately, we all too seldom hear Bible teaching on these aspects of the fire of God's glory, highlighting the fact that one of our greatest needs is a far greater understanding of God's character and ways. Psalms 104 verse 4. Who maketh his angel spirits, his ministers a flaming fire. Job 36 verse 26. Behold, God is great, and we know him not, neither can the numbers of his years be searched out. Job 26 verse 14. Lo, these are parts of his ways, but how little a portion is heard of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand? If we want to be trusted with the fire of God's glory through us, we will have to be subjected to the same fire to burn out everything that is not Christ-like.